All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Lessons from Terrible Students. As always, we are the Terrible Students. My name is Jeremy. That's Sarah. Sarah, say hello to everybody.
Hey, everybody.
We have a couple of extra terrible students today. Ryan, everybody should remember from our last episode. He works with us. He's fantastic. We have another one that if you are real good friends of the show, you'll know his name too. So we have Dr. Emory Daniel from App State. He's going to be joining us because what we're going to be talking about today is a continuation on reading levels and literacy, how that affects adult learning, what we need to do about that as learning professionals and all that kind of stuff. So it should be a great conversation today. Before we jump into that, as always, this podcast is brought to you by Lumius. At Lumius, we are your partners in learning. Okay, so to start with, Ryan, you did your introduction last episode. We're going to assume that still stands.
It still stands.
This is like your third episode running, so we're just going to assume everybody knows who you are at this point. Dr. Daniel, if you will give us a quick introduction to remind everybody who you are.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Again, my name is Dr. Emory Stephen Daniel. I am an associate professor at Appalachian State University in the Department of Communication. I teach primarily advertising courses, specifically related to social media usage, as well as media planning, which is what I like to say, it's the where and when of advertising.
So thank you, Doctor. Emory and I know each other a long time, so I call him Doctor just because it still kind of freaks me out that he's a doctor. But
same.
Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. I wanted to start off by just going over some of the stats and the information that I found as we were researching this. So just to get some of the numbers out right at the beginning. So on average, 79% of U.S. adults nationwide are literate in 2024. So they have some level of literacy. Now, the flip side of that statistic, 21% of adults in the U.S. are illiterate in 2024. So we're going to break that down a little deeper. 54% of adults have a literacy below a sixth grade reading level. So that's sixth grade is typically 11 to 12-year-olds. And sixth grade reading level is important because that is what most print media, that's what most learning documentation, that's what most things are written to, is a sixth grade reading level. So anything below that sixth grade reading level is considered, or I guess I should say below a fifth grade reading level, is considered functionally illiterate, which means you do have some idea of how to read. There are, like, you can read some things, but you will struggle when looking at any kind of reading material that is mass produced, because most of that is on a sixth grade reading level. So now 20% of that 54 are below a fifth grade reading level. So that does make them what they call functionally illiterate. So you will struggle in your life because of your reading level, because all of these things are written on a sixth grade reading level, and your reading level would be below that if you're in that particular group. So with those, the U.S. as a country ranks 36th in all country in literacy. I could not find the other half of that number. I don't know it's 36 out of what, but we rank 36th in literacy, which is not great. All of these numbers, as the more that I researched these numbers, honestly, the more depressed I got. And let me expand into that statement a little more. I have always been an avid reader. Obviously, I sit here in front of a bookcase full of novels and things like that. So that, it's one of those things where I cannot imagine a world that reading is not something I do daily, because I do. But I've always known that that is not most people's reality. That's not how most people operate. But digging into these stats and realizing how many people just do not have the capacity. It's not necessarily that they don't want to; they just never learned how or can't.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pause there because I've got more things that I want to hit. But I wanted to pause there and get everybody's reaction to these stats. And they're not hearing these for the first time. I have been depressing them for about 2 weeks now. As I find these stats, I'll send it to them. So I wanted to pause there and just kind of get overall thoughts on what you thought when you heard those stats for the first time and kind of what popped in mind.
So first of all, I thought I didn't realize there was a difference between like functional illiterate and illiterate. So that was, useful information for me to understand the difference. And I'm right there with you, Jeremy. It's difficult. My parents were avid readers. We had a library in our home, and I read all the time. My books are usually audiobooks these days because I'm a busy mom, but I couldn't imagine a life without stories and using my imagination. And it shines a light on a lot of things and just where we're headed and what that means for us as learning and development professionals, and how we accommodate those learners. So we've got a lot of things to dig into, I think. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, and I will add context to what Jeremy was talking about so that everyone understands. I want to thank Jeremy for last Monday, 8 o'clock in the morning, passing out these links to everyone. 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, we lead off with this stuff, but it was shocking, right? We all know that there are people that are functionally illiterate, but seeing the statistics are startling. And Jeremy, you mentioned, always having been an avid reader, and I will say I am now, but I wasn't always, right? And so I sort of think back to middle school, high school. If I hadn't gotten into reading more in college, and even more after that, I wonder what boat would I be in, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I didn't is I didn't have to, right? So you would have reading assignments in school. Well, we had Cliff Notes, and part of it is it's not that I couldn't read the assignments, that I didn't want to. I'm not interested in that book, but the whole class is reading the same books, then we can go discuss and things like that. It wasn't until later when I started finding books that I was interested in, mostly sci-fi type stuff. I got into a little bit of horror and things like that. And now I've always got a book I'm reading. My mom's the same way. She was, always, every night before going to bed, she reads. And so that tends to be when I read, is before I go to bed. But it wasn't really forced upon me. And I wonder if that's sort of the case for a lot of people. It's like they don't learn to read at a certain level simply because they haven't had to.
It's interesting that this podcast refers to the terrible students, specifically because I feel like I'm a little bit in the minority here, that I really don't enjoy reading myself that much. And I think part of it is because that's my job. My job is to read and to write. And so I have the good fortune of reading on two opposite ends of the spectrum between very stuffy academic writing and student papers, which hit a very different level of interpretation, vocabulary. And it is so exhausting that I really do not want to curl up with a good book at the end of the night. Now, that is not to say that I don't find myself reading every now and again. When I find the stories that I like, I very much enjoy it. I really enjoy playing like role-playing games, which require a lot of reading. I try to justify that myself sometimes when I'm not doing that, because I'm with you, Ryan, especially of when I find the stories that I am interested in, I'm invested, and I will spend the probably way more than I should, uh, really captivated in that story. So, but it is interesting with time as well. There's always been this conversation within uh, speaking with students, for instance, of why they never get into politics, for example, and time is always the number one thing that comes up. And I can't help but wonder if there is some correlation, for instance, between our perception of how we view time and our time and how much time do we have to read recreationally.
That's yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that.
Definitely. I'm just thinking about, kids growing up who maybe have greater responsibilities in their families to help, raise their siblings or get a part-time job, or, what that makes me think about is kind of reading, having the time to do it, and it's a privilege almost, it's for a lot of
Yeah,
people. So,
and it breaks down even into like the next section, which is kind of how we're teaching children to read, um, and that has a huge part on it. So not only like even if excuse me, even if they had the opportunity to read and the time to read, which Sarah, you're absolutely right. There's probably a lot of children out there that do not have the time, opportunity, and access to be able to read. That is absolutely a level of privilege, right? Like there are just some that do not have that opportunity. But then, even if they have the opportunity, are we teaching them the best way to learn how to read? Because there are, I didn't know this until I started researching this, but we are just now coming out of what they call the reading wars. Like that is something that has been going on for a while. And this is essentially how do we teach young children, elementary school children, how to read? And there were two ways that people were taught how to read. And I think all of us were taught the same way, I think. And that's by using phonics, sounding words out.
mhm.
That is the backed by science way to learn how to read. There is another
Remember
way.
on Onyx?
Hooked on phonics. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
There is another way that people were taught how to read, and it was meaning based reading. So they were essentially, they did away with phonics completely. You did no phonics, you did no sounding words out. You looked at a picture and using context clues and other methods like words you already know and kind of guessing what's in the picture, you would essentially guess the word. So if you come across a word you don't know, you don't sound it out. You guess by the context that it is in what that word is. And it's supposed to, quote, lean on children's innate love of reading. So it's based on this idea that all people, 100% of people, innately know how to read. They
I
want to
love
teach
that you
people
use the
how to
word
read.
innate.
Yeah, I'm stressing those words for you, right? That they wanted to teach people how to read the same way they learned how to speak their first language,
Hmm.
which was essentially they had to immerse them in it. So there's two reasons why this meaning based reason kind of doesn't work. Um, the first is we're not all the same. There is no innate thing that 100% of the population has in common, right? Other than we're all human beings. There's no like so if you're leaning on a child's innate natural love of reading, that may not be there. And the other one is there was never any scientific study behind this type of reading. It was kind of something that somebody came up with and made a lot of money on, and then a bunch of other people bought it and people just don't like to admit they're wrong. So a lot of school districts, they just started teaching it. So I won't go
So
into the long and short of it, but they eventually they started phasing phonics back into the meaning based reading, and now we're coming out of post COVID. I think everybody has moved on to what they call code based, which is using phonics and sounding words out, and how all of us were taught how to read. So there's 2 hour long YouTube videos on the reading wars and what led up to it, what happened, and who they think is responsible for all of that and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to get into all of that, but I just thought it was interesting that not only will maybe kids don't have time, but they may come from a generation that learning professionals like us, we didn't teach them the correct way to learn how to read, and it made it frustrating for them. So
Was this widely adopted, Jeremy? Like this
yeah,
practice?
yeah, it was essentially, I don't know the numbers, but essentially the country was split in half. Like half of the country was using this meaning based type reading in early elementary school. The other half was using code based, which is, phonics and sounding words out, things like that. But yeah, it was essentially almost like half and half, because it was a popular science at the time, and it was easier on the teachers, this method of reading, because essentially the idea was you would just have them trying to read as much as possible. Like you would just always be shoving a book in their hands and immersing them in reading. But if you don't know how to read and somebody keeps shoving a book in your hand, like it's going to produce this level of frustration that I can understand why people never want to pick up a book again.
Yeah.
I don't remember if we've talked about it on the podcast, but Jeremy, Sarah, you guys know this about me, that I have taught high school and middle school. I taught band and private saxophone lessons. So when I think about those age groups and teaching, one of the things that I'm surprised is that the discourse around all this is about teaching kids how to read, which I think equally important to that is teaching kids how to enjoy reading it, right? It comes down to motivation, and being a teacher of an elective like music, it's a little bit of a privileged position where you don't have to take it if you don't want to. But that is one of the things that I've noticed over a lot of kids, that they were in it for the social events. They didn't necessarily enjoy the music, and so they didn't work at it. They didn't get better. But some of them, if you focused on, okay, what kind of music do you like? Let's look at that instead of the standard assignments. You need to learn this etude, that etude, and whatnot. Some of those kids would then start to learn to like it, and then the work towards learning how to do it better followed. And so whenever I hear about these different methods of teaching how to read, or anything really, but I don't hear anything about how to get kids to either enjoy it or see the value in it at the very least. Motivation plays a big part in learning, as we know that as learning professionals.
Yep.
I just don't hear a whole lot about that.
That's a good point.
It's interesting that you bring that up, especially with what's kind of the end goal with it, because when I'm thinking about that, of my own reading journey when I was younger, because I was in the boat of I didn't want to read, I didn't enjoy reading, and I think for a lot of us, because I can see the grounds for both sides of the war, so to speak, and I think there's an area of where people are trying to get these young students to a point of self-efficacy when it comes to reading. So it's not, so you can do this, like if you were to read a really challenging book, you could get through it and say, man, I conquered this book. I think I still do that. It is, I'll sit there and look at all my books on my bookshelf. And I was like, I actually read all that, by the way. But it becomes less of the achievement of reading and more of the kind of enjoyment that you feel with it, and gaining that efficacy that you're like, I can do this, and because I can do this, it's something that I want to do this. and I pursue it. So I can see, for instance, where the context clues would be a very interesting way versus how we all did it, which you know if we're just driving that message based on repetition, that can also become stale and difficult. And again, I understand where you're coming from, Jeremy. Of like, I never want to pick up a book again, but I think it was in the same boat of hooked on phonics as well. It's like I don't want to deal with this.
Yeah, and motivation is a big piece of it because I
Sure.
remember, like, there are certain books that I read when I was younger that I think really solidified me into reading often. Um, and I think there's, if you can find something that you're generally interested in reading, then reading kind of becomes its own reward in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a motivation piece there. But I remember when I was, in elementary school, it was Goosebumps and Animorphs. That was my stuff. Like I
Yeah,
was.
goosebumps.
Yeah.
By the way, if you have a young reader, do not give them the Animorphs books. Like those are, they say they're young adult books. I don't know if anybody's ever read those books. They're not young adult books.
Nah.
There's some stupid, serious themes in those books that you do not want elementary school kids reading. Just saying. Um,
But if it
but
came down to them not reading and choosing that book,
yeah, then give them the Animorph books. But there's like it tackles like who you are as a person. Does war change you? Does violence change you? And these are written on like I think they're written on like I didn't look it up, but they're written on like a fifth grade reading level. I think like definitely an elementary school reading level. It's a young adult novel series that came out years ago. There's been a TV show and a movie that were both lackluster at best, but like these are the book series that really solidified my love of reading, and then I kind of branched from fiction into nonfiction as I grew older. But yeah, I mean, I think motivation is a big piece of it. So it's interesting to me how, I mean, it begs the question, right? What do we do as learning professionals, right? How do we've now identified that this may be an issue now as well as going forward. The stats that I've read back from 2012 to 2024 shows that these numbers aren't changing a whole lot. I wouldn't say they've plateaued, but they're not changing a ton. And when they do change, they go down. So the trend at this point is not that reading comprehension and reading levels are getting better. It's that they're getting worse. So as learning professionals, three of us in the corporate world, one of us in the academic world. So the question is now, like, how do this does affect us. How do we go forward knowing what we know, and how do we go forward adjusting for this if need be? And we talked a little bit about that on our previous episode as far as how we did that in a little bit more of an extreme manner, because we had to go all the way down to a third grade reading level for that particular project, which is not ideal. But
so the reality.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I wanted to start with the doctor. So I mean, you're meeting these folks before we are. We get them when they come into the working world, right? You're getting them right when they come out of high school, essentially. I think. I'm assuming. I don't know if you're a 101 or a.
I'm in senior level courses, so they're right before they see y'all.
Oh, okay. All right. So not right out of high school, but right before we see them. So I kind of wanted to, and why I originally reached out to you is I wanted to get your opinion on what you're seeing, how it's affecting your work and how you're addressing it, and then we'll discuss how we need to address it on the corporate side as well.
It's touchy because I've been in academia for, gosh, including my graduate work, around 20 years now, and it's interesting that you mentioned the wide demographic of the reader, that it was kind of in that sixth grade level. And as somebody that's taught media writing before, that has come up is saying you need to write for around a sixth grade level. So it's something that I would say that I we definitely recognize it. It's definitely something that comes up in many conversations in my department. Um, I will mention though, it's something that I don't know has changed all that much from somebody that went to Appalachian State to then was hired by Appalachian State. I still see very much a lot of the same students then as I do now. So I think a lot of things, and I don't want to go too off topic with this, have changed in the sense of the tools that we have to help us with that. So, I mean, Ryan, you were mentioning having either like Spark Notes or let's see the other one. Why am I blanking on Cliff Notes? Thank you. Um, we've always had these tools. So, it went from Cliff Notes, it goes to Google, it goes to TikTokers, and, now we have AI. And so this comes up quite a lot into the reading and writing of everything here, because all you have to do is look up a term that I assigned y'all for media planning, and Google will spit it out. Not very well, I might add. Media planning's I'm very fortunate in that, because I think Google's so bored with media planning. They're like, I don't know what a gross rating point is, or how it's measured. So it is one of those things that I do assign a lot of very short writing, because, it's copywriting. So it's advertising, for instance, and writing in such a way that you are digesting it at a very quick level. So, I don't get a lot of major papers that students have to write, but I do get some every now and again. And as far as the changes and ways that I've assessed it, I've gone to a number of pedagogical conferences that have addressed how do we teach, and how do we put things together. And reading comprehension is something that comes up, and I don't know that there's any baseline answer other than read. Just read, keep reading. Not to pull the Malcolm Gladwell thing that everybody talks about of the 10,000 hour rule, but there's something to that. Of the more you read and the more you get used to it, that's where comes self-efficacy, where you want to learn how to do that. But I always kind of want students to take their own work and assess it. Too many times I think we in academia have this mentality of submit something and then it's done and you get the grade. And that's all they're focused on. And I'm like, that's not how, at least in advertising or in journalism or in PR, it works. There is a revision process, because if your writing sucks, they sure do not want you taking that to the public. You're in for a very bad time, and we've seen on many occasions here. So I don't grade the brainstorming. So I let them come up with these ideas. I let them write. When I did media writing, one of the things I did was an editorial process. So I wouldn't assign them a grade right off the bat. If they were fine with it and they didn't care, then I would leave it be. But if they were dead serious about getting a better grade for something, then they had to edit it. And they had to put something more coherent together, which required more research. It required interviewing. It required checking your sources. And that was something that I felt like it was something that was taught to me, that was a very helpful skill, not only in the terms of being able to critique your own writing, evaluating sources, but also gaining the validity of those sources and reliability. Because we talked about this before I was on this. I think this is just as much as about media literacy as it is about literacy, and being able to fact check, be able to check various sources. So there's that. I usually, when it comes to AI now, I have them check the papers that are written through AI, the ideas that are given through AI, and say, fact check it, see what they're doing. And I think through this, I'm All I'm trying to do is do what any time a new tech has come on the scene, which is because, and I love that you'll said kind of move laterally in terms of the teaching, because I don't think the teaching has to change all that much. But what has to change is how we're viewing the new tech and the new ways we experience communication and reading. And in which case, it's short term platforms, for instance. And I often, when it comes to AI, at least, I often shift over to the side and say, okay, fact check it. It's just no different than what I did when I taught with Wikipedia.
Yeah.
It's no different. You know, so those are some ways that I've encountered not only this topic and discussed it, but also ways that I've addressed it, at least in academia. Um, I hope, at least on a functional level, maybe not so much a corporate level, that people would take those ideas to heart and be able to implement them in their own lives when they receive news. Because, you know, doing stuff in media, that's something that comes up quite a lot.
I bet.
Yeah, I am going to, for the sake of timing, we're going to sidestep media literacy because,
Yes.
as everybody on this call knows, I could talk about that for hours. I'm not going to touch it.
Podcast too.
Sorry, occupational hazard.
No, you're fine. I love that you brought it up, and it does have bearing there. But just to keep this under a 5-hour podcast, I'm not going to get started on my own soapbox onto media literacy and all that kind of stuff. But so that is senior level college folks. So that's
Yes.
the assumption being after they leave that, now it's our responsibility to teach them, right? That's our job. So they're going to hit our new hire classes. They're going to hit our orientation classes, our compliance classes. Those are the first things that they do when they do find employment. Those are the first things that they're going to experience is another type of learning environment.
Sure.
So the question at that point is, how are we handling it? And, you know, you referenced something that we were talking about prior to jumping on this recording, which is thinking laterally about it and not necessarily using long form prose or anything like that, which as learning professionals, we try not to do anyway. We don't like to blast you with a huge amount of text anyway. But even more than that, I think maybe going into different modalities, going into using video or things like that. But I don't want to take up all of this with my thoughts. Ryan, Sarah, what are your thoughts around how we address it from like a corporate adult learning perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to remember when we start talking about that is the Dr. Daniel's students, when they move into the workforce, are likely to be at the higher end, right? They've gone to college. We're training everyone, and understanding our specific target audience is going to be important because maybe a lot of them didn't go to college, didn't finish high school. And so they're going to be in a different place for how we approach their training. And what you were also talking about with different media types and whatnot, just going back to the case study from the last episode, if the reading level has to be at the third grade level, my argument is that it does not need to be in a book. It does not need to be read. We need to approach it differently. Perhaps it's a series of micro e-learnings that are all voiced out. Perhaps it's a series of videos, short videos, maybe TikTok style, depending upon the target audience, right? But I think that's the first thing we sort of have to keep in mind is that we're talking about Dr. Daniel's experience with his students, but when they enter the workforce, they have gone through college. They're going to be further ahead than a lot of the populations we may need to train.
Yeah, that's where my brain goes to, Ryan, is just thinking about everything we've discussed, even down to like when we're learning to read and how we fall in love with reading or we don't. And, you know, and oftentimes as L&D professionals, when clients come to us, they know exactly what they want us to create, right? Or we've done an analysis and we know that we need to build some sort of process, onboarding, new hire, whatever that looks like, right? And so if we can kind of start thinking outside of the box and think about ways to engage learners in things that maybe feels more interesting to them, like how can we do that? Just like thinking about that is at the forefront of when we create training, but more so, I think, Ryan, about the audience, right? Like knowing our audience, who we're building training for, and then choosing how to deliver that based on that, knowing what we know now about reading levels. And if you're building manager training or onboarding training, knowing that your audience is mostly at a third grade level or somewhere around there, obviously videos, things that are going to grab the attention of the younger generation, which are things like TikTok, things that are quick hits, podcasts. We've done those before for learning. So yeah, I just think it's, for me, this whole conversation really triggers the thought of we are going to have to challenge ourselves to be more creative and think outside of the box in the future. And remember, not only do people learn differently, but now we're talking about their ability to understand what they're learning, what they're reading. So just validating that the best we can,
and so you mentioned challenging ourselves, and I think that's very important, but also being willing to challenge our stakeholders as well. Because a lot of times the stakeholder comes to the table, they're not an L&D professional. They say, hey, we've got this need, and I want this to be the medium, right? And so instead of just jumping and saying, okay, yes, let's do that, take a step back, let's analyze what the needs are, let's analyze the target audience, and if it's discovered that it's a third grade reading level, then push back on that. No, you probably let's consider something besides a booklet.
Yeah,
it needs to be at this level. Let's explore some other options. And I feel like for learning and development professionals, that's sometimes a challenge to push back on the stakeholder. It's like if you're working internally at a company, a stakeholder could be several levels above you.
Yeah.
Right. So it's easy to just, yes, whatever. If you work at a company like Lumius, where you're working with other companies that are your customer, then it's equally as challenging, right? That's the customer, right? They can leave. They have options, right? But if we are truly doing our jobs well, I feel like we take that extra step and we make the recommendations as a partner.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said with tangential learning as well. When it comes to if our goal, for instance, is to help with this area of functional literacy, there have been methods, for instance, in terms of how we can incorporate things that people do enjoy and have them read along with it. I know something as simple as, I don't have data for it, but I know something as simple as closed captioning subtitles for things like streams, for instance, which I don't really subscribe to too many people when they say, well, I have no attention span. I'm like, you watch somebody play a video game for 6 hours straight. Don't tell me you don't have an attention span for this.
Right.
But there have been a lot of fantastic inclusionary efforts for people who are hearing impaired for closed captioning and subtitles. But at the same time, it's gotten to a point where my wife and I won't watch a movie without them now, specifically for the point where I love being able to see a line that I missed, like what were they saying all those years ago, and be able to have it. Additionally, things like Spotify has their own little karaoke thing that you can click on. So there are ways that we can include this in our tangential learning, that we're not seeking it per se, but it is something that's already there. And so, again, even with the TikToks of the world, you can see there's closed captioning for stuff like that as well.
Mm-hmm. And we do offer that as well, right? It's something that gets negotiated at the sales level because it takes additional time to do that. But that is something that a lot of people want, and optional subtitles as well, right? Toggleable.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's, I would love to say that's the end of the conversation, but it's not really. But it's the start of the conversation. But unfortunately, we're coming close to time. I will say that um, there is a bit of me, and this is where I have to check my own bias. There is a bit of me that says maybe we do have some kind of responsibility to assist them in their reading comprehension and things like that. But maybe we don't. Like that's not within scope, which is our word that keeps us focused, right? Like it's not our scope for our previous case study was not to graduate them to a fourth grade reading level. It was just to make sure they understood the content that we were tasked to provide them. So that's where I have to check my own bias and go, okay, this is not something that you can fix. Like you just have to operate within what you now know is the reality. So I think that's where a lot of my dissonance is coming in is where I don't know. I feel like there's got to be something we can do, but all we can do is make sure that our particular material is understood by the audience that we have.
Sure.
And that's where our responsibility lies, is to make sure that our learners and our students know and understand what they came to learn when they leave the classroom, and that's all we can do. So, Dr. Daniel, I appreciate you jumping on with us again. Always fantastic to have you. Ryan, you know you're awesome. We appreciate it. Sarah, I always appreciate you. You're fantastic, and we're going to end it there. Any final words of encouragement to overwrite my terrible ending note there?
Yeah, I feel like it's just, we have to remember the world changes, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad, right? We tend to think of it moving away from what we're used to as being bad, but that's not inherently bad, right? It's just we need to keep up with how our learners are learning.
Yep. Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for having me, y'all, again. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that when it comes to media, it is a tool, and so in many ways, this is the kind of thing that when we have these tools, we use them. And as you were mentioning, Ryan, every generation will look back at the one that is coming up and will criticize the tools that they use. And I would encourage you to look inward a little bit and say, if you had those tools, would you be doing the exact same thing? I begrudgingly, because I'm becoming my own little ball of cynicism here, where I say, yeah, I might use something like a TikTok or AI if I was in that position. So use those tools and be able to. I'd love to have it to where it's like pushing people forward to enjoy more reading, but at the same time, again, as everybody's mentioning, know your audience and know how to pursue those conversations with them.
Yeah. Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We will catch you on the next episode, and have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.